Hey, y'all. Welcome back to Winning Season, where we share strategies to level up in your career. And it's winning season for us all. Before we get into today's episode, I have to tell y'all what I'm sipping on. I did something wild and crazy today. I mixed my regular espresso shot with this tonic that I've been talking about on the podcast. So there's cacao, there's reishi mushroom, there's ashwagandha in here, and ginseng. So as I'm talking to our special guest, if my energy seems off the chart, it is because of her, not because of this crazy espresso mix. So today we have a phenomenal guest. If you listen to the podcast, you know about 2 months ago I said, I hope I can get this person here. Guess what? She is here, Fadjanie Cadet. She is a top 100 under 50 emerging leader. She is an inclusion and transformation strategist, certified organizational development and DEI leader, and she's known for blending heart and strategy for a workplace that feels and performs at optimal levels. She's also a board member and she is a member of the Society of Human Resource Management and lives in the greater Boston area. Okay, y'all see why she's amazing, why I was excited to have her on the Winning Season podcast. Fadjanie, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Jacqueline. You read all of those things, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's a mouthful. But it's been a busy career, I guess. Thank you so much. It's an honor to join you here this morning. I couldn't imagine a better way to kick off the week than this conversation with you.
So we intentionally made this one of the first episodes at the top of my week because of my excitement levels as well. So I read your bio, but tell us who you are. What's the in between of the bio? Give us more insight into who you are.
Yeah, so I've spent all of my career in the HR or talent space. And I remember when I was an undergrad, that wasn't necessarily the initial path for me. So both my parents are immigrants, migrated to this country from Haiti. And if you know anything about immigrant culture, Black immigrant culture specifically, there's sort of like a handful of jobs or career paths that make sense for you. Either a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. There's really nothing else in between. And so I went into school knowing that I didn't want to do any of those things, but really trying to convince my parents that I could land something that was secure and stable. So I started thinking I was going to be an accountant, quickly realized after a couple of internships at one of the big four, that wasn't for me, and really wanted to figure out where I could, like you said, blend heart and strategy. And so I navigated into the HR space. And I've worn many hats. I've been a full cycle recruiter. I've done learning and development, employee relations, business partnering, all of those things. And I always say that informally, I've been doing the work of culture and inclusion and promoting equity, but formally transitioned to doing that from a title perspective over the last 6 years or so. And so I really bring my lived experience to my work. Identifying as first gen, I bring tenacity, resourcefulness, curiosity, lean into trying to understand people. And that's really sort of the guiding light for me. I want to create spaces, workspaces where all people feel seen and can thrive. And that's been the anchor.
You have this knack for performance management. What are the common misconceptions about performance management that you've encountered in your career?
Such a great question. So one of the biggest misconceptions with performance management is that it is just about annual reviews. Too many companies, too many leaders sort of treat performance management as a one-time event. Some companies a biannual event instead of an ongoing, continuous conversation. And performance management is holistic, right? So it's coaching, it's continuous feedback. It's not just ratings in the traditional sense, which is typically how folks think about it. And some people, particularly in recent years, classify performance management in one way and then like talent development in another as sort of two completely different things, but they should be deeply connected. And we've started to see a little bit of like an evolution in that with job titles over the last couple of years. It's important to ensure that employees are meeting their goals and their performance expectations, but they can only do that if they understand their roles. And we're focused on it as an organization on skills and capability building. And so development drives performance, right? The two have to be connected. So that's, I would say, one of the most common. The other thing I'd say is that it's like an HR thing. When we think about performance management, it's typically classified under the HR umbrella, but it's not something that should be owned by HR leaders alone. The best leaders, the best people leaders understand that managing performance is like a business strategy and a leadership responsibility. And so leaders that are building psychological safety, that are focused on making sure people understand how their work connects to the bottom line, so psychological meaningfulness, leaders who make sure that people have the tools, the resources, and the support that they need, that psychological availability in order to drive performance, those are the leaders that are driving success in their organizations. And so those three things that I mentioned, psychological safety, psychological meaningfulness, psychological availability, they're Dr. Khan's top three drivers of employee engagement. And I like to return to those three things as the center for a lot of things in this work.
What emerging trends in organizational development excite you the most and why?
I'm really excited about the shift towards skill-based talent strategies. And so evolving the way that we look at qualifications, which is such a strange word. I don't like that word because we have to move.
Tell me why.
Because qualifications comes with a connotation of job tasks, meaning did somebody do this particular thing before? Did this person have this job title before? Rather than focusing on transferable skills and experiences, more and more companies are prioritizing building internal mobility, like building that bench internally, developing talent rather than defaulting to finding folks to fill roles externally. In doing that, we really have to focus on continuing to develop folks internally, but then looking at what are the different skill sets, the different experiences that folks have had in other roles in other organizations that could be innovative in our new organization, in our organization in this new capacity. That's something. So that skills-based hiring strategy. The other trend that I'm seeing is more of a focus and integration on behavioral science and change management, right? And the human side of that, I think companies right now particularly are facing lots of disruption. We have the cultural disruption. We keep talking about burnout and employee engagement, and that's one piece. But then we have technological disruption with Gen AI and kind of the changing the future of work and how we work. And we know that people don't resist change. They certainty. And so I think those organizations that are leveraging and prioritizing neuroscience-backed change strategies, human-centered leadership that are building trust and making change feel less intimidating are the ones that are going to sort of successfully end up on the other side. And they need those skills in order to equip their people to lead through change successfully.
What are some indicators that signal that a company's performance management processes are effective?
Yeah, the first that I'd say, like the clearest indicator, is that employees understand what's expected of them. That there are clear goals and clear feedback loops. People know what it means to show up as their best selves. People know what success means for themselves, for their teams, for the organization. So clear understanding and consistency across the board from that perspective. Then I would follow up and say that people actually feel safe giving and receiving feedback. So the first thing is people know what is expected of them. How are we defining success as an organization? And the next thing is, are people actually feeling safe to have these clear feedback loops, to engage in these development conversations? If managers are only talking about performance when something is wrong, if we are limiting development conversations to that one-time annual event or a biannual event, then we're doing something wrong. That's a red flag and not an indicator of an effective performance management process. High quality conversations happening regularly, and the sentiment from teams that performance decisions are fair, right, and equitable. Those are the things that I would say are the clearest indicators of a successful and an effective performance management process.
So, y'all add this to your leadership toolkit, these successful indicators, so that you can outline and determine if you're on the right track. So, along with that, how do you ensure that there's alignment between an individual employee's goals? Because you said it's not like an annual event. The broader organizational goals, especially right now in this VUCA environment where
Yeah.
everything's shifting multiple times a day.
Yeah, absolutely. It starts with open lines of communication, transparency, right? It starts with transparency. Employees have to understand how their work connects to the bigger picture, right? And that goes back to something that I mentioned earlier, that psychological meaningfulness, which Dr. William Kahn says is a key driver for employee engagement. In order for us to realize high levels of employee engagement, people need to know what they're doing here and why it matters. And so I love cascading goals, ensuring that our team's objectives as an organization are broken down into meaningful, actionable priorities for team members. I know what this means for this company. Therefore, this is how the team contributes to that. Therefore, this is how I contribute to that as an individual team member operating within this ecosystem, right? When people can see how their jobs connect, they're more motivated to bring their best work. And they typically do, right? That typically happens. When we are, it's particularly in an environment that is a bit more volatile than we're used to, we have to continue to have those conversations. And so as an organization or leadership, we shouldn't just be having a conversation about our broader goals at the top of the year. We should probably be revisiting those on a quarterly basis and really encouraging teams and individuals to have agile goals. I've heard them referred to as living goals, goals that can be adapted and broadened, or maybe even scaled down if need be, depending on where we are and what sort of internal and external factors are impacting us at the time.
Really love this concept of the cascading goals. And how do you identify and nurture your high potential talent? What are
Yeah.
your go-to strategies for this?
I love this question and this idea of high potential talent because, to be honest, I feel like a lot of organizations are still working through this. I don't know that any organization has necessarily found the magic bullet by any means. And in the organizations that I've worked with, in my experience, this is typically something that a lot of companies are challenged with. The first thing is organizational leaders need to define what high potential actually means, right?
That
We
part.
we use this terminology, we use high potential as sort of like a classification tool for succession planning, but they're typically in the organizations, that I've been exposed to, there isn't a clear understanding of what that means, a socialized definition and consistent criteria from team to team, from level to level, etc. And so typically, I would say high potential is based on who's the most visible or who
Okay, now we're
has.
getting into some real tea.
Yeah, right. Like who's the most visible? Who is has some social capital within the
Right.
organization? Who's connected to decision makers? That's the first thing, right? And we can have a separate conversation about how that social capital is built and what are some of the roadblocks, the barriers for different folks depending on their backgrounds and experiences. So it's typically based on that, but also who has the highest ratings, performance ratings, rather than who's actually delivering impact or has a growth mindset. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions around identifying high potential talent is that high performance means high potential. And high performance
That is a
alone,
myth we have to bust.
yes, high performance alone does not equate to high potential. You have to have a history of consistent high performance in order to be, as one of the criteria for identifying someone who's high potential. But it is not that alone. And typically that is the leading, and in some organizations, the only indicator or criteria for identifying high potential talent. And at the root of that, I think busting that myth, right, demystifying, is evidence of a growth mindset, right?
Uh-huh.
I encourage organizations to look at three sort of key factors when identifying high potential talent. The first is the performance piece, as we talked about, which is the foundation. Are they consistently exceeding expectations? Yes. Then ask yourself, can they adapt, learn quickly, and thrive in ambiguity? This is one that I think is too often ignored
Yeah.
or not prioritized, because someone who is and has performed at a high level but hasn't experienced tumultuous things in the organization, someone who has not had to adapt or be agile or learn a new skill or deal with a challenging client or have to onboard a team member who has a non-traditional background, right? These are just examples, but is there an evidence that this person could be a leader for the future of work? Because what the last couple of years has told us is things can change at the drop of a dime. and they're going to shift, and we need leaders who can't just perform today, but can we have the confidence that they will be able to perform tomorrow regardless of what tomorrow looks like. And so also considering, does someone have an evidence of growth mindset or a growth mindset approach to work is critically important. And then the last thing I would say is leadership influence. So do they have high levels of EQ in addition to IQ? Elevating the people around them. Because again, when we know that we are navigating change and disruption, we need people who can motivate, inspire, and empower people around us. Once you've identified those three things or focused on those three things, then I think we have our high potential talent. What then do we do to nurture them? I think investing before there's an open role, right? Thinking about how do we invest in the leaders of tomorrow. And now there's the informal things, right? Like giving them stretch assignments, training, right? Like technical training, of course. But then I think equally important, if not more important, is some of the more formal investments, like structured sponsorship programs, right? We talked about that social capital earlier before, really providing opportunities for those folks to have increased visibility across the organization, across and up, needed to secure those opportunities. So it's not enough to just build the skills, but how do we also build the relationships that are required in order to get folks to the next steps? We have to be proactive and intentional in that.
This holistic approach, you keep giving us different angles to think about our organization and the employees from a holistic perspective. And again, as you drill into the details, what you're showcasing for us is it's not a one size fits all approach. You have to tailor these experiences for your organization and your employees.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to get more into your go-to strategy. Walk us through how to get someone quickly on board with organizational change. You've mentioned volatility, you mentioned ambiguity.
Okay, so including them. And I know that sounds so simple, but often when we're moving fast, when we're facing internal and external pressure, it's a critically missed step. People need to feel heard before they can be led. And so my go-to strategy, I always default to listening. And not listening to respond, but genuinely listening with a willingness to be influenced. Listening to people's concerns, the skepticism that they have, but also the fears that they have around a change, around disruption. And then I would say, as a follow-up to that, I acknowledge all of those very real and human feelings that research has told us time and time again are associated with change. Once people feel heard and then they're validated, it's so much easier to bring them along, to be able to connect the dots in a way that makes sense for them. How is this change going to benefit you personally, benefit you in your role, us as an organization, this industry, et cetera, excuse me, right? I think, again, we're back to our key drivers of employee engagement. Now we're back to psychological meaningfulness, and we're talking about psychological safety as key drivers of engagement. Including people, genuinely listening, acknowledging their concerns, their feelings toward the change. And then now that because you have the information, you're able to connect the dots and reframe the narrative in a way that's going to resonate with them deeply. I think another tactic is mobilizing your champions. And so focus on those early adopters who are on board, the people who understand the change and are excited about it. Organizational leaders, both positional and cultural ones, who others can trust. Like, find those early adopters, those influential employees, and get them on board. You leverage them and get them on your side to help sort of build some momentum.
What I hear you speaking about and alluding to here is a feedback culture as well.
Yeah.
So let's go there. Let's talk about some practical advice that you give companies when you're consulting with them about establishing a healthy feedback culture, and keyword healthy.
Yes. Heavy on the healthy. Make feedback normal. Encourage those continuous feedback loops. Open and transparent communication is key. I've said it before. Do not wait for formal performance reviews to start having development conversations, even when they're the difficult ones. The strongest people leaders weave feedback into everyday interactions. And also remember that positive reinforcement is just as important. What I've noticed is Part of our reservation, part of what keeps us from giving and receiving feedback is we've somehow, given it this negative connotation. That feedback is something that could only be negative, that we only provide constructive criticism. But feedback can also be positive, right? And we have to normalize that. People need to know, what they should stop, but also continue doing. And so part of making feedback normal is also building a healthy rewards and recognition culture. Feedback shouldn't be full stop. It should always come with a path forward. What's next? How do we improve? What support do you need in order to in order to continue this? What support is available? But we can only identify those things when we're having these conversations regularly and openly, and making sure that we are not just giving feedback on what's not working, but that we're celebrating what is working and how folks are contributing to the bigger picture in that way.
Appreciate how you're taking the concepts that you shared with us in the beginning and you're breaking it down in these practical ways. Here's what you do instead of that once a year annual event or that semi-annual event. So what do you see, and you alluded to this a little, what are some of the common pitfalls in performance reviews that organizations should avoid?
Yeah, two big ones. The first one is, as I just alluded to, is focusing only on weaknesses, right? How do you build a strengths-based feedback culture? And so not only focusing on gaps, but also performance reviews should be about growth. It should talk about how we went from here to there. What are you doing well that you can maybe coach or mentor another person on? If our people are walking away from performance reviews feeling defeated, feeling deflated, confused about where to go next, instead of motivated and with a plan, then our process has failed. That's one of the major ones. Another one that is huge is not taking the time to focus on mitigating feedback bias. Now, hear me out. There's a company called Textio. It's an HR tech company that conducted a study a couple of years ago. I think they've done it twice now, in 2023 and 2024. And their study highlighted the prominence of gender and racial bias in the performance feedbacks that folks are getting, right? The data tells us women tend to get more personality-based feedback. It tells us that BIPOC employees, and particularly Black employees, receive more unactionable feedback despite receiving less feedback overall. One of the biggest opportunities there are is companies should be investing more time in training managers, not just on our process or why performance management is important, but specifically how to write clear, actionable, non-biased performance feedback, right? How to stray away from personality-based feedback. What is the language that we should be thinking about that are the red flags, and how do we focus on outcomes as opposed to personality? Because that same report from Textio also tells us that employees who receive low quality feedback are 63% more likely to leave an organization within a year, and that is especially for the high performers.
Wow. And we know the cost of turnover is outrageous. That's such valuable data to have. I want to shift gears just a little bit, get more into your career. What key skills or experience have shaped your success in organizational development?
Yeah, such a great question. Honestly, being thrown into the deep end.
Okay.
Right? My last 3 roles did not exist before me, and I've had to build, influence, and execute from scratch. And that has really taught me to be resourceful, to listen. I mean, really listen, like I talked about before, and also operate with confidence, even in times of uncertainty and ambiguity. That is really has been the foundation for me. Now, a couple of years ago, I did complete my OD certification from the Institute of Organization Development. And so that also gave me a foundation for key frameworks and change methodologies that has also helped me thinking about change and impact through a systems lens. And then I also believe that my experience as a culture and inclusion leader has really nurtured and developed my emotional intelligence, my level of empathy to be a human-centered leader, which is so critical for leading people through change, understanding how do people experience change on both the neurological and the emotional level. really helps me build strategies that stick.
This is so exciting because what you've done is you've talked about your practical application and then what you've done throughout your career to stretch. I really appreciate what you shared about you created your last three roles. They did not exist. And as I hear you speak about data and you're pulling in different data points, it really showcases how intentional and strategic you are as a leader to support organizations and why you end up creating roles for yourself. You have this masterful blend of data and empathy. EQ helps you to lead within organizations. I have a few
Yes.
more questions here. Example of how your approach improve company performance specifically, like a case study.
Sure. One example that comes to mind, at one company, I helped redesign their leadership development program for their emerging leaders audience. And after noticing a major gap, that gap being there was very little representation across the nominees in previous years. I believe the program had existed for about 2 to 3 years prior, and every year, part of the process was to reach out to people, leaders, and ask them to nominate the emerging leaders on their teams for a part of this development program. And year after year, the nomination pool looked the same. And that signaled a significant opportunity area for me. So the first thing we did, going back to what we talked about earlier in this conversation around high potential talent, was create a talent mapping framework to really help managers define and identify high potential talent. Right. And so we wanted to create a tool so that folks weren't just, picking up or deciding who was high potential based on any personal bias or organizational bias or ambiguity, but really creating a tool, a 4-box tool that they can use to really think through who on their team should they be considering, and kind of seeing where they all are on a map together visually. And so we implemented this tool, and part of the tool was introducing 2 new criteria that folks were not thinking about before, right? That growth mindset that I talked about before, and influence as 2 critical components of that 4-box. And that influence, again, think both positional and cultural leaders, not just folks who have been in leadership roles or managed people or are on a particular, level in our organization, but who are those people who really people trust, can get behind, and have influenced over their time. And so once we trained managers on this new tool, we then redesigned the content of that development program to be a more interactive cohort-based model that integrated building capabilities against these new components. So what does it mean to build your capabilities around growth mindset, to build your capabilities around influence, to strengthen that potential that we've already identified in you? And as a result of that, within a year, we saw a 23% increase in BIPOC nominations for the program. And it was incredible. The hope was that that's what we would see. Didn't expect to see that number. What that told us was, again, when we think about sort of being inclusive and designing systems and programs that work for everyone, it doesn't have to be, we didn't have to go to leaders and explicitly tell them or mandate that they increase representation in their nomination pools. What we had to do was raise their awareness of the different ways to think about potential, the different experiences and skill sets that folks bring to the table that are going to be aligned to the future of work. Naturally, organically, what we saw was that it broadened the aperture, that folks started thinking differently. And we saw that 23% increase immediately. And what that does for us as an organization, aside from building our bench or increasing representation in our leadership bench, is it ultimately strengthened our hypo-identification, our ability to identify high potential talent, and it set the foundation for an even more inclusive and data-driven or data-informed succession planning.
Fadjanie, you have just given us a masterclass, and I've had a front row seat to your TED Talk. I feel so honored that you opened up and you shared this knowledge with the winning season community. So you all see why I was so excited to have her on. But before we go, I have some rapid fire questions.
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so what is giving you hope right now? And pick from this category: movie, TV show, or book.
I'm going to go with book. because I've been reading a lot. 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership by John C. Maxwell.
Love that. I have that book on the other side of this
Yep,
room.
it's right here for me too.
Are you a popcorn or cookie fanatic?
I'm probably popcorn. My favorite like snack is Smart Food popcorn.
Okay. And tea or coffee?
I drink coffee more frequently, but I love a nice cup of tea.
All right. And last question. Do you hit snooze or do you hop straight out of bed?
I gotta get up. I have a 3-year-old, so I'm a pop right out of bed.
That's parent mode where you're like,
Yeah.
no, don't have that luxury to hit the
Yep.
snooze.
So I usually jump out of bed and start my day.
Thank you again for coming to the Winning Season Pod. Tell the folks how they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. Well, first, Jacqueline, thank you so much for the invitation and for such a rich conversation. Truly an honor and a privilege. Folks can connect with me via LinkedIn. So Fadjanie Cadet, go to LinkedIn. There you can find my Gmail, and it's my actual email, so you can reach out to me directly. You can go to my website and submit an inquiry if you're looking to work together. LinkedIn is the go-to place to go to connect with me.
Connect with her. She is a wealth of knowledge, as you heard here. This is probably an episode that you're going to listen to more than once. And from the gems that you found in this episode, I hope that you're able to implement them into your work life sooner rather than later. So until next time, y'all, continue to emulate excellence and eliminate excuses.